Violent scenario, the representatives of law enforcement agencies and authorities were sure they were doing the right thing and were acting in an absolutely lawful manner. After all, they believed they were facing enemies, not law-abiding citizens.
I thought the main problem was going to be understanding the psychology of the people inside the compound. But as I got into it, I quickly became aware that the psychology of the people outside the compound was more important to an understanding of what happened. They needed to take control. And the tactical people, in particular, needed to show him who's boss.
We are trying to reinforce to them that we are in charge of the situation, that the compound is under the complete control of the government. It is in fact no longer their compound, that we have the ability to exercise whatever control we want over that compound. And we will do that from various times to demonstrate to them the fact that they are impotent in their ability to control their everyday lives.
I'm prepared to share David Koresh's contention that we should wait on God to resolve this. The FBI is God. It's going to decide how this is going to be resolved.
The federal agents in charge of the operation were confident that they were in control of the situation, but this firm conviction was in fact an illusion instilled by the anti-cultists. In reality, they were no longer in control. It's the anti-cultists who had originally created this situation and held the levers of control. Such manifestations of abnormal behavior are clear signs that perception of all these people had already been distorted at that time by the manipulative technologies of subconscious suggestions used by anti-cultists.
The FBI also employed aggressive psychological tactics during the Waco siege to supposedly force the besieged to voluntarily leave the building. Water and electricity supplies were cut off. Powerful floodlights were aimed at the ranch windows, shining around the clock to prevent the people inside from sleeping. Loudspeakers continuously blared irritating noises and high-volume music. A tank was brought in to clear the area around the building, crushing cars and nearby structures. Clearly, the mere presence of military equipment had a strongly demoralizing effect on the people inside the building.
If they thought that we were all brainwashed and such a bunch of crazies, why would the FBI push David or the rest of us to the limit? Why would you bombard the building day and night with lights and music and noises and wear these people out not knowing how they're going to react?
These pieces of equipment were unarmed, as I understand it, and were contracted. I mean, it was like a good rent-a-car.
A good rent-a-car? A tank going into a building?
Why did the FBI use such methods against peaceful Davidians? Who was behind plotting the tactics of aggressive psychological influence on the besieged people? It's an established fact that the stress escalation strategy employed by the FBI was based on the recommendations of Rick Ross and his accomplices. Moreover, further investigations revealed that the FBI followed the advice of anti-cultists and applied to the Davidians' typical deprogramming techniques, including depriving Koresh and his followers of food, water, and sleep, and repeatedly exposing them to excruciatingly disturbing sounds. In other words, the tactic of aggressive psychological attack on the Davidians was nothing but an attempt of mass deprogramming. It means that the anti-cultists, who had mastered their skills of physical and psychological violence on individuals, in the case of the Davidians, made an attempt to deprogram a whole group of people. This proves that sabotage of peace talks and protracted siege of the building were originally instigated by the anti-cultists, who sought to put an end to the activities of the Branch Davidians by first exposing them to psychological pressure. And when it became obvious that deprogramming methods failed, and on the contrary, only united the people inside the building, the situation took a fatal turn.
The catalyst for initiating the forceful stage was the unfounded conclusion by FBI agents that there was no reason to believe the Davidians would leave the building voluntarily. This was reported to the U.S. Attorney General. It is worth noting that throughout the siege of Mount Carmel, it was repeatedly observed that the actions of the tactical team of federal agents sabotaged the work of their colleagues in the negotiating team. The goal of the negotiators was to build rapport with the Branch Davidians in order to gain their trust. In contrast, the tactical team's efforts were aimed at intimidation and harassment. The negotiators themselves noted that such aggressive tactics undermined their own attempts to gain Koresh's trust and achieve a peaceful surrender of the Davidians. Moreover, the FBI actually made their statement that further negotiations were pointless after an agreement had been reached between their agents and the leader of the Davidians, David Koresh, that all of the Davidians would voluntarily leave the building immediately after Koresh would write his interpretation of the 7 seals of the apocalypse.
Definitely, those people were perfectly aware that the law enforcement officers intended to stop the activities of the Branch Davidian as a religious group. They realized that as soon as they would exit the building, they would be immediately arrested, and their children would be taken away by social services. Despite that, they agreed to come out, while the media promoted the anti-cultist mindset that Davidians were an allegedly dangerous suicidal cult. In fact, those people clearly demonstrated by their actions that they wanted to live, and they fought for their lives to the end.
On April the 14th, there was a major breakthrough, and that breakthrough was David Koresh's letter to me, which I promptly gave to the FBI, that said that he'd received his mission, that he was working on writing his interpretation of the 7 seals, and that everyone inside was relieved that they didn't have to die now, that the prophecies were not being fulfilled now, and that this would be resolved.
He waited 51 days, and then he said, the word came to him and said, write, and he wrote. This was brought out the day of the fire by one of the survivors. He was keeping his promise of April 14th. We believe they would have all come out safely.
What I was faced with was a situation where the negotiators said, we think we have reached an impasse. Nobody else is coming out voluntarily. We looked at the entire situation and we made the best judgment we could. I'm very satisfied that in the information furnished to me by the FBI, I was informed.
A key factor that significantly influenced the decision-makers was a speculation that the children in the building were in danger, and that they had allegedly already been victims of abuse. These claims were fueled by the series of articles under the collective title, The Sinful Messiah, co-authored by Mark Bro and Rick Ross. Based on the belief formed under the influence of these anti-cultist narratives promoted in the media, the U.S. Attorney General decided that it was necessary to begin an operation to free the hostages and assault the building where Davidians and their children were located.
The Bureau, time after time, asked Koresh for some evidence that the children were okay. We did not receive verification that the children were okay. We had concerns for the children.
Their concern were the children. They had candy bars in their pockets to give out.
Chocolate for the kids. Wow.
The Davidians themselves had no idea that an attack was being planned against them. On the contrary, they believed they had made progress in the negotiations and that the ordeal they had been enduring would soon come to an end. They didn't know they had only 1 day left to live.
Hello? Hello? No, honey, nobody's gonna come and kill you.
Are they gonna come and kill me?
No. No. Nobody's coming.
Final day. On the 51st day of the siege, on April 19th, 1993, armored vehicles were sent to the building where the besieged were located. The vehicles began meticulously demolishing parts of the structure and releasing a special gas inside.
The gas supplies a number of irritants to the nostrils, to the eyes, to the skin. Just touching to the skin can be extremely painful. You can have certain symptoms of nausea, You can have certain symptoms of inflammation with regard to membranes. So it is extremely uncomfortable.
They would be coughing, choking. They would probably be unconscious. Some of them would probably be dead. Some would be basically inert. They may still be alive, they may still be breathing, but they're not going to be doing anything.
The falling walls, destroyed by armored vehicles, effectively killed some of the Davidians, as evidenced by forensic reports. The tank repeatedly drove over their bodies, tearing them apart. Then, a fire broke out in the building, in 3 different places, simultaneously. The officer in charge of the operation refused to allow firefighters to approach the scene, claiming that the Davidians might shoot them.
This looks like probably the fire chief and fire marshals, and we have, at this point, 2 fire.
When the fire did start and the fire trucks did arrive, I didn't let them in. I held them at the checkpoint because I didn't want the firemen to drive into gunfire. I just wasn't going to permit it. And it's a terrible thing and a very terrible decision to have to make.
This is not the way to end this. Lead your people out, David. Be a messiah, not a destroyer.
After American citizens were poisoned with gas and their house was set on fire, the authorities kept shouting, "Get your people out, David," even though they knew very well that there was no one to come out. Many were already dead at that moment, and the rest were burning alive. This show was staged by the representatives of the law enforcement agencies for the media and possible future investigations in order to avoid responsibility. Mount Carmel burned to the ground. 76 people died, including 25 children, some of whom were infants and toddlers under the age of 3. The organization leader, David Koresh, was found with a gunshot wound in his head. The causes of the fire remain undetermined to this day. Less than a month later, bulldozers destroyed the remnants of the burned buildings, which critics of the government regarded as an attempt to cover up the circumstances of people's deaths. A year after those events, representative of the anti-cult gang and deprogrammer Rick Ross, who had a dramatic impact that contributed to the tragic outcome of the Waco events, was already describing David Koresh's personality and characterizing the Branch Davidians in new media, reports in the following way.
Even after the deaths of those people and their children, anti-cultists continued their smear campaign to demonize the Branch Davidians, aiming to cement the image of sinister cultists, psychopaths, and suicides in public consciousness. They used this horrific tragedy for their own ends, turning it into an informational terrorist act, essentially an act of intimidation for all other religious communities and a precedent for undermining public trust in law enforcement agencies of our country, which were supposed to guarantee lawfulness and order in society instead of causing mass deaths. Since the FBI controlled the flow of information about the Davidians in the media, they were never able to share their own version of events with the American public. All Americans have seen in the media are images of the crazy David Koresh, and the same repeated unsubstantiated accusations by anti-cultists. Dehumanization of the Davidians, combined with the anti-cultists' manipulative techniques, turned the American citizens into a faceless group of religious fanatics. Such media coverage of the events produced an illusory perception that the deaths of American citizens were not a ground for public protests against excessive force used against them. Therefore, until the very last moment, the entire country was silently observing the events in Waco as yet another reality show until those people and their children burned alive in the fire. Realization of what had happened started coming much later, and not to all observers of this terrorist attack organized by anti-cultists. Even now, in articles about those events, you might see the phrase, "About 80 cultists died," not people, not American citizens, but cultists. This terminology is used by anti-cultists and their supporters to ensure that the deaths of those people do not evoke sympathy or regret in you. It is meant to absolve you, as a society, of guilt for allowing this to happen, and for letting the actual perpetrators of this mass murder go unpunished. The Waco tragedy, the terrible death of all those innocent people and their children, is essentially an act of genocide carried out by anti-cultists through representatives of the authorities and law enforcement agencies. And in this case, those who committed it are no different from the Nazis during World War II.
When someone's suspected of a crime, even if it's child abuse, even if it's capital murder, we give them a trial, a jury finds them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt before they go to sentencing, then a jury or a judge sentences them, and an appeals court makes sure the trial was conducted with due process. And then and only then do we kill them. We don't kill them first, like happened in Waco on April the 19th.
Aftermath of the Waco tragedy.
And I'll remind the American people one more time that during that entire time, those 6 hours, and indeed those 51 days, the FBI never fired one shot at the Davidians.
David Koresh and the Davidians set fire to themselves and committed suicide. The government did not do that.
Assertion to me that the media and that the government has made a kind of blanket declaration that the Branch Davidians committed, quote, mass suicide, to equate it to a Jonestown, Guyana suicide.
The Bureau's efforts were ultimately unavailing because the individual with whom they were dealing, David Koresh, was dangerous, irrational, and probably insane. I was, frankly, surprised would be a mild word to say that anyone that would suggest that the Attorney General should resign because some religious fanatics murdered themselves.
The Waco tragedy became one of the most significant and bloody failures of American intelligence agencies in the country's history. Being under the influence of manipulative techniques by anti-cultists, federal agents committed physical, psychological, constitutional, and judicial violence against American citizens whom they regarded as members of a dangerous cult, thereby despising them and not considering them humans. To this day, this event remains the most severe case of Americans confronting Americans since the Civil War between the North and the South, and it happened as a result of manipulative actions of anti-cultists. American citizens who followed the events in real time were divided by contradictory media reports, actually the result of orchestrated information terrorism by anti-cultists, into those who regarded the Branch Davidians as an insane, suicidal cult, and those who believed the deaths of almost 100 people were due to reckless actions of federal authorities. However, the majority of the American public became angry at the FBI. Federal agents were seen as demons, uncontrollably killing peaceful citizens. Later on, among peaceful citizens there emerged avengers, that is, new terrorists created by the media's informational acts of terrorism, who were actually yet another victims of the anti-cultists. This eventually culminated in the Oklahoma City bombing.
Oklahoma City bombing, April 19, 1995. On April 19, 1995, the second anniversary of the Waco events, an unknown individual drove up to the building housing the FBI and ATF headquarters. That day, the terrorist wore a t-shirt bearing the phrase shouted by Abraham Lincoln's assassin after he shot him, "Sic semper tyrannis." That's what always happens to tyrants. He parked his van in the underground garage directly beneath the building. A few minutes later, an explosion occurred with the force equivalent to a 3.0 magnitude earthquake. Half of the building collapsed, turning into a mass grave. The blast also damaged 324 buildings within a 16-block radius. The tragedy resulted in 168 deaths, including 19 children under the age of 6, and 680 people were injured. The perpetrator, Timothy McVeigh, was apprehended the same day. He explained his actions as revenge for Waco and Ruby Ridge. To this day, the Oklahoma City bombing remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history.
And what did you do to these people? You deprived them of life, liberty, and property. You didn't guarantee those rights, you deprived them of them.
Waco started this war. Hopefully Oklahoma would end it.
The Oklahoma City bombing vividly illustrates the profound impact of the Waco tragedy and the informational terrorist act created by anti-cultists on its basis. For many people, the Waco siege crystallized an already distrustful attitude towards the government, while for those inclined to radical views, those events contributed to regarding the state as a ruthless enemy of its own people. The events in Waco marked the beginning of intensification and radicalization of the anti-government movement within the country. To this day, Americans consider April 19th to be a symbol of confrontation between the people and the government. From that very day, in the eyes of many Americans who witnessed the death of their fellow citizens live on television, America ceased to be a safe land of freedom and democracy. Instead, it became a country where the government could turn against its people.
I don't know how the American people can stand by and watch such a thing take place. We have people out here, we have all these people, women, children, tiny babies. These men came in here and they started firing on us. The bullets came through the walls and people were killed, people were injured. And this is America?
I mean, I thought this was the country of, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, whatever, and just human decency. It just doesn't seem to exist.
Waco still resonates within the anti-government community as an event that demonstrates the federal government does not protect its citizens, that it is willing to violate their civil rights and take away their guns.
The Waco siege became a symbol of discord over a range of issues, such as violence and gun ownership, trust in government and state authority, and religious persecution. The catastrophe sparked a flood of books, articles, news stories, and television segments, becoming an integral part of public discourse. Waco became a vital topic in the country, and to this day, Americans experience its consequences. The most significant and most frightening consequence of the Waco tragedy was the deepened division among the American population, a divide that, unfortunately, has not been overcome to this day. A country and a people that once stood united were split into two warring camps, and this painful wound on the body of America has not healed to this present time. Representatives of the anti-cult movement deliberately shaped two extreme viewpoints on the Waco tragedy. As a result, descriptions of the Waco events in various media are often so contradictory that it looks as if groups of people who oppose each other describe completely different occurrences.
NBC television aired the government's official propaganda as a movie, showing Branch Davidians at all the windows with guns waiting for the ATF to arrive.
The anti-cultists are largely responsible for the enduring impact of the Waco tragedy on America, which goes on to this day. They have used the Waco siege to create new information terror campaigns aimed at destabilizing authority and influencing the political situation in the country, significantly contributing to polarization of U.S. politics. It is because of the anti-cultists that the fire in Waco was ignited, and it is because of them that it continues to burn to this day. Back then, anti-cultists laid the foundation for a future civil war. They artificially created a basis for confrontation between supporters of the two dominant political parties in the United States and provoked the emergence of not only discontent with the authorities, but also extremely radical sentiments in society. The anti-cultists still use these fruits of their own activities, continuing to incite hatred in society and create conditions for a future confrontation between citizens of one country, between us, Americans. The anti-cultists arranged the terrorist attack in Waco with the help of their main accomplice, the media and dishonest journalists under their control. And if back in 1993, Rick Ross and his companions labeled a community of about 100 people as a cult, which resulted in their murder and a chain of terrible consequences for the United States, the other anti-cultist and deprogrammer, Stephen Hessen, has gone even further. At the current stage, he has already labeled tens of millions of Americans as cult followers. Such rhetoric that dehumanizes a part of the American nation creates prerequisites for intranational conflict and violence against labeled citizens. It is also noteworthy that this rhetoric amazingly repeats the narratives of anti-cultists in Russia, who label the people of America as one big cult. Yet, before, they manipulated only their own people in this way, setting up Russians against Americans, whereas now, the agent of the anti-cult gang in the USA, who's been conducting his destructive activities here for many years, repeats the same actions, but this time from inside America, setting Americans against Americans. Moreover, Stephen Hessen has already gone further, saying that the entire USA needs to be deprogrammed.
And the bottom line is all of America needs deprogramming because we've all been negatively influenced by Donald Trump.
What is meant by deprogramming the entire country? Remembering what happened in Waco, Texas, and how their deprogramming ended, just imagine in what way the anti-cultists plan to expand their methods to the entire United States of America. The main question is, with whose hands do they want to implement their plans this time? After all, as anti-cultists understand it, deprogramming implies the use of violent methods to force people to renounce their beliefs. Isn't this the main motive and driving force of a civil war, to force one part of the population to give up their views and to submit to the will of another part of the population, thus labeling a part of Americans as adherents of the cult of Trump and calling for deprogramming? Hessen straightforwardly urges Americans to use force against other Americans. The most terrible thing is these are not just words and not mere appeals, but hidden destructive imprints that are embedded in those words and have repeatedly caused deaths of a huge number of people. And believing that they won't work this time is foolhardy at the very least. Recall German citizens who assisted Nazis, released gas and poisoned people, being fully confident that they were doing the right thing by ridding their nation of the Jewish threat. Those were actually the same people as you. And to this moment, no one has found an answer to the question of what turned them into monsters. Or putting it more correctly, who made them that? Yet, now you know the answer. Just think about it. Right now, anti-cultists are forcing us Americans, a nation that defeated Nazism, to use Nazi methods for destroying each other. They already successfully tested this scenario in Waco, when they carried out a large-scale operation involving the country's mainstream media, which resulted in the genocide of honest, peaceful, and decent Americans committed by the authorities and law enforcement agencies. How can you explain a situation where American law enforcement agencies tasked with protecting their people arrived for a routine search and ended up launching a full-scale military operation using military equipment against ordinary citizens of their country, which resulted in the deaths of almost 100 people? Indeed, from the perspective of common sense, a military raid that cost the U.S. government millions of dollars a day and was carried out against a group of American civilians that mostly included children, women, and elderly people looked like a disastrous misunderstanding. Why did the representatives of ATF and FBI accept the false, ungrounded information provided by anti-cultists as facts? Why did they rely solely on their pseudo-expert opinion at a time when the FBI had materials indicating that those people were incompetent in such matters? Moreover, FBI agents knew perfectly well that Rick Ross had personal hatred towards all kinds of new religious movements and an undisguised desire to urge law enforcement agencies in their attempt to destroy the Davidian group. In other words, federal agents had all the information they needed to understand that relying on anti-cultists in the matters of new religious movements was the same as believing that the Ku Klux Klan would remain impartial in assessing racial minorities. Yet, why did the agents trust the anti-cultists and implicitly follow their recommendations? Because representatives of intelligence services, law enforcement agencies, and the government were manipulated by anti-cultists who pushed for a violent crackdown on their stigmatized victims. In essence, officials were programmed for such actions. Let me draw your attention to another crucial point. The Waco tragedy occurred in 1993, the same year when the central ideological hub of anti-cult terrorists was established. Its leader was trained at a Russian Orthodox Christian educational institution in the United States. This means that even at that time, there were already breeding grounds for global anti-cultism of the Russian origin in the US, and they had enough influence to carry out such terror attacks. But that's not all. I delved into such detail about those events so that you can fully understand how representatives of anti-cultism operate and what the consequences of their actions are. The thing is that during the Waco siege, the FBI consulted with another cult fighter, Igor Smirnov, a Russian scientist and inventor of mind control weapons.
Igor Viktorovich Smirnov was a Russian scientist best known for his role in Soviet-era mind control research and the poorly explored field of human behavior study he called psychoecology. His maternal grandfather, Smirnov Ornaldo, was a renowned hypnotist. Igor Smirnov was the son of a high-ranking Soviet officer, Viktor Abakumov, head of SMERSH from 1943 to 1946, and Minister of State Security, MGB, from 1946 to 1951, under Joseph Stalin. At one time, Smirnov's father initiated an Operation North on mass relocation of supporters of Jehovah's Witnesses organization, as well as representatives of other religious associations and their families to Siberia. Despite his scientific activity, Igor Smirnov, just like his father, had anti-cult views, as he wrote in his book Psychoecology. Thus, in describing various religious groups, he solely used anti-cultist language and the label sect. He also adhered to the same pseudoscientific theory about the use of brainwashing techniques by leaders of new religious movements, which was actively promoted by Steve Hassan and Rick Ross. This was at a time when Smirnov was personally involved in the development of such technologies. Most of Igor Smirnov's research focused on remote influence on another person's consciousness and programming one's psyche and behavior. Application of psychotronic weapons developed by Smirnov included the potential to affect large groups of people for various purposes. For example, to incite mass aggression in a crowd, or, conversely, to calm public unrest. The majority of the experiments he conducted remain classified to this day. Smirnov wrote, "Psychotechnologies are the culmination of everything humanity has engaged in thus far. They are much more serious than the atomic bomb and space flights. Right now, we have only created a stone axe. Although using it, we can already perform surgical operations. We have obtained instrumental ways to access the subconsciousness and correct certain areas. Everything else is just specific applications." Smirnov also worked on uncovering hidden information in the subconscious, representing the true motivations behind a person's actions and intentions. He developed a method for identifying individuals potentially inclined to commit acts of terrorism. The question remains whether the goal of this development was to prevent terrorist acts, or to find individuals who could easily be turned into new terrorists if desired. Regardless, this method formed the basis of security systems designed for airports to identify terrorists before they attack. Today, this technology is used in various countries, including the United States.
Igor Smirnov worked on concepts such as psychocorrection, a term he used to describe application of subliminal messages to alter a subject's will, or even to modify their personality without their knowledge. Federal agents intended to use Smirnov's techniques to resolve the situation in Waco.
Two Russian psychologists have been brought in from Moscow to demonstrate a technique for analyzing the human mind and then influencing it. The concept is that with an understanding of an individual's mind, keywords transmitted in music or white noise will force that person to obey. The FBI examined the system to use against David Koresh at Waco in Texas.
Thus, the FBI Counterterrorism Center experts secretly met with Smirnov in the United States. He proposed a plan. During negotiations, they should transmit messages from relatives of the Davidians, encrypted in a certain way that would bypass critical perception and be instilled directly into the subconsciousness of recipients, compelling them to follow these commands. In this case, the commands would be to leave the building and return to their families. For the leader of the Davidians, David Koresh, a special voice was planned to be used, allegedly the voice of God, that would be played by an actor and urge Koresh to surrender voluntarily. However, when agents asked what would happen if the subliminal signals did not work as intended, Smirnov replied that Koresh's followers might slit each other's throats, committing acts of fatal violence. According to the official version, the FBI declined Igor Smirnov's services after this kind of response. But that's the official version. Now, let's piece together the facts. Fact 1. At one of the press conferences, an FBI representative publicly stated that during negotiations with David Koresh, the leader of the Davidians, an agreement was reached that the people would peacefully leave the building. However, Koresh suddenly changed his mind, claiming he heard the voice of God telling him to stay and wait.
Steve, I want him to come out.
I understand.
When does he plan to come out?
He said his God says that he is to wait.
How long? How long does he...
Look.
He says that he did not fulfill his promise to leave immediately with his followers because God told him to wait.
Do you people believe that Koresh is actually talking to God?
Koresh believes he's talking to God.
This fact, strangely, aligns with one of the steps in Smirnov's proposed plan, except that the effect of the supposed voice of God was exactly opposite to the declared result. Fact 2. Smirnov used manipulative techniques to influence human behavior by inserting hidden messages. These commanding messages were recorded on tape and technically altered to conceal their presence from conscious awareness. By bypassing critical analysis in one's consciousness, those commands were directly implanted into subconsciousness, urging a person to carry them out, believing it to be their own conscious decision. To an untrained ear, such technically processed recordings of hidden commands sounded like the squeal of pigs. Now let's return to the Waco siege. As already mentioned, the FBI used psychological pressure techniques on the besieged Davidians, one of which involved loud, irritating sounds. Official FBI reports and eyewitness testimonies state that among the sounds broadcast through loudspeakers were the sounds of animals being slaughtered, including the screams of rabbits being killed. This inadvertently brings to mind the sounds of pig squeals used in Smirnov's mind control experiments.
Sound tapes of rabbits being slaughtered, or Nancy Sinatra singing songs, and then they would bring out lights at night, and not that Nancy Sinatra always was that bad, but the ones that she had the point was this: they were trying to have sleep disturbance, and they were trying to take somebody that they viewed to be unstable to start with, and then they were trying to drive him crazy. And then they get mad because he does something that they think is irrational.
I don't know if you can hear the noise on this tape, but that's some of the noise being made up there by the compound.
This raises a question. Why would the FBI use such strange sounds for a psychological attack on the Davidians? However, these actions gain an utterly logical explanation when combined with Smirnov's plan and the deprogramming methods used by anti-cultists against the besieged.
One question remains. What was the true purpose of the plan proposed by a man who collaborated with the KGB to American intelligence agents as the final solution to the issue of the supposedly dangerous and sinister cult? What hidden directives were then transmitted through those encrypted sounds? And who was the intended target of that influence? We have seen what was the ultimate outcome for the Davidians. However, the law enforcement officials present at the Waco siege could have also been affected by those sounds. Moreover, Timothy McVeigh, the perpetrator of the Oklahoma City bombing, visited the site in 1993 to express his support. The man later bombed the FBI and ATF building to avenge Waco. Did he hear the sounds that echoed throughout the area? The likelihood is very high. Was he a victim of anti-cult programming? He definitely was. We cannot assert that Smirnov's psychotechnologies alone influenced him. Multiple layers of embedded directives played a role in this case. Those directives were part of other waves of informational programming launched by different branches of global anti-cultism. In reality, the psychotechnologies used by Smirnov were merely a stone axe, as he himself put it. Far more effective and sophisticated are the hidden manipulative techniques employed by anti-cultists, including puzzle programming, where information codes are embedded in the words themselves and do not require any special technical means. To an average person, such words, phrases and their combinations, or the frequency of repetitions may seem unremarkable and draw no attention, but for those who understand the principles behind their arrangement, they are like precise mathematical formulas. Using those formulas, one can assemble specific people at a particular time and place to perform a specific action. And the likelihood that those formulas will work is close to 100%. These are ancient manipulative methods that predecessors of the anti-cultists used as long ago as in the times of Christ to make the crowd shout, "Crucify him," just as humanity has been working throughout history to improve various types of weapons. In the same way, methods of psychological manipulation were being refined for an external invisible force to subjugate a person's will and to enslave them. Based on these ancient methods, further developments were conducted in secretive research bureaus in the Soviet Union. These same ancient methods were adopted, refined, and implemented by the Nazis of the Third Reich. Today, using these manipulative technologies, representatives of the anti-cult movement turn ordinary people into bio-robots who become remotely controlled weapons aimed at targets the anti-cultists designate. These are facts supported by the 30-year history of the criminal network of anti-cult organizations. That's exactly how the FBI agents, officers of other law enforcement agencies, and government officials who were present at the Waco siege became victims of anti-cultist manipulations. They were all caught in the crossfire area of exposure to the informational programming waves created by the anti-cultists. They were literally zombified. This explains why they were confident in their actions, considered themselves professionals, and believed they had the situation under control, while in reality, they were basically puppets externally manipulated by a maniac. How else can we explain the strange behavior of those who carried out the Waco operation? Why lock those people up like lab mice in a cage and subject them to acts of psychological terror using hidden manipulative techniques? The siege of the Davidians and the final assault didn't look like a hostage rescue operation, but rather resembled a prolonged and excruciating torture. And who were actually the hostages if everyone remained in the building voluntarily? Official representatives and operation leaders stated at press conferences that they were primarily concerned about the children in the building, fearing they might be subjected to abuse by the Davidians. But what did they actually do to those children? They not only exposed them to danger, creating conditions for a tragic outcome, but also let them burn alive by preventing fire trucks from reaching the burning building.
We thought that their instincts, their motherly instincts would take place and that they would want their children out of that environment. It appears they don't care that much about their children, which is unfortunate.
Moreover, on the day of the assault on Mount Carmel, the FBI used the combat chemical agent CS against civilians, including innocent children and infants. Those who gave and executed the orders knew the Davidians had gas masks. But they also knew that the only ones unprotected from this gas would be the children, as their faces were too small for wearing the masks.
He actually drove right through the middle of the building into the kitchen area and basically at point-blank range fired gas into the concrete room where the women and children were. In a cul-de-sac like that where there was no ventilation, they must have been going through.
There was only one door?
Front, one entry. Yeah. There was no windows, no back door or anything like that.
We put massive gas in there. Their gas mask by that time had to be failing.
I believe that using CS gas against infants, against old people with respiratory problems, there were 60, 70-year-old men in there, and there were young children. That's torture. And I can just see those kids barfing, vomiting, screaming, because you can't possibly have a gas mask that'll fit a little kid.
Didn't their report say that gas masks don't fit on these babies?
That's correct.
And didn't they know that?
They should have known that.
Even small doses of CS, much smaller than those used at Waco, can kill children. In large quantities, this gas causes severe muscle spasms, so intense that they can break bones. The Waco events resembled a torture chamber created for those people by a deranged maniac, where the parents were powerless to act and were forced to watch their children suffocate and suffer from broken bones due to severe muscle spasms, and then to burn alive along with the kids. Those who were still able to move after being gassed tried to escape the fire through the only door leading outside from their shelter, but they were shot. Government defenders claim that the Davidians killed each other in an attempt to escape the torment. Meanwhile, government critics refer to infrared surveillance footage and argue that the Davidians were shot by law enforcement from an armored vehicle as they tried to flee the burning building.
In my rolling on the floor and trying to protect myself from the heat and being in the pitch black, not able to see, that the voices of those behind me screaming kind of got through to me.
My God, torturing babies and saying it's part of their job and saying it's okay because their parents were bad.
The mother of Pablo Cohen, an Israeli Jew, talking to an American Jewish lawyer, watching that gas be inserted into that building, watching an American tank knock down an American house and then it burst into flames, And you imagine the images in an Israeli's mind with the Holocaust survivors in Israel? I couldn't answer. I think you can tell from today, it's not often that I'm without words. But I could not explain to her how that happened, and her answer, her question was, I thought he would be safe in America.
The final point of the Waco tragedy was when law enforcement officers raised their flag over the ashes of the burned building and the charred bodies of the deceased, just as one would after winning a battle in the war. But can the siege, psychological torture, and militarized confrontation against a group of peaceful civilians who were unable to resist such an overwhelming force be considered a battle? Does such behavior by individuals who are supposed to serve their country and uphold the law resemble the actions of normal, sensible people? Why did these people become like this? Who impaired them? The answer is clear. These individuals, much like the Davidians who died at their hands, fell victim to manipulative techniques employed by anti-cult gangs. In fact, everyone understands perfectly well who actually burned down the building in Waco while people were still inside. In this way, the law enforcement and authorities tried to cover the traces of their crime and safeguard themselves. They were aware that the American people would never forgive them for such an egregious crime against their own citizens. As seasoned professionals, the operation commanders must have realized they had gone too far with the use of gas, resulting in the tragic deaths of people, especially children. That's why the order was given to shoot Branch Davidians who attempted to escape the burning compound in order to prevent them from revealing the torture they endured, how their children died from the gas, and who actually set their house on fire. You can intimidate or bribe one or a few witnesses, but if all these survivors had given the same testimony about what happened to them inside the building besieged by the law enforcement, the authorities wouldn't have been able to hide the truth about the Waco tragedy. Yet, don't be quick to blame only the federal agents and authorities. There are no mentally healthy people in the world who could resist the level of psychological brainwashing techniques used by the anti-cultists in Waco against law enforcement officers and other officials. Only those with special training and awareness of the principles behind such technologies can protect themselves from these covert manipulative methods which influence human subconsciousness, bypassing critical perception by the conscious mind. At that time, no one among the U.S. federal law enforcement officers knew about these techniques of covert subconscious behavioral programming used by anti-cult organizations. For this very reason, the anti-cultists succeeded in carrying out such a powerful terrorist act in Waco, which in terms of its role and consequences is no less significant than the 9/11 attacks they later orchestrated too. Yes, the federal law enforcement officers acted unlawfully. They broke their oath to serve and protect the American people and waged war against their own citizens. However, by then, they had been literally brainwashed by the anti-cultists and had themselves become victims of coercive psychological influence. In this case, the subconscious destructive commands and directives for aggressive and violent actions, embedded deep within their subconsciousness without them knowing it, significantly overrode their conscious behavioral motives. That's why the real actions of the Waco operation commanders directly contradicted their official statements and declared goals. And that's why they caused horrific and painful deaths to children despite numerous expressed concerns for their fate during the Waco siege. All of the decision-makers were largely unaware of the real causes of their own actions. It was precisely the destructive commands embedded in their subconsciousness that compelled law enforcement officers to act with Nazi-like methods. Hence, in the United States, a free country, law enforcement locked their own citizens inside a compound and released gas into it. They acted this way because they had undergone severe psychological manipulation by the anti-cultists, just as the Nazis had once been manipulated. At that moment, U.S. law enforcement no longer regarded the Branch Davidians as human beings. They treated them as the Nazis treated Jews at the final stage of genocide. The tragedy in Waco, with the horrific deaths of all those innocent people and their children, was not merely a terrorist act, but a genuine act of genocide perpetrated by anti-cultists with the hands of government officials and representatives of law enforcement agencies, meaning with the hands of American citizens against other American citizens. At that moment, those who committed it were no different from Nazis during World War II. This underscores the insidious power of subconscious suggestion and covert techniques of manipulating consciousness that are used by representatives of the transnational terrorist network of anti-cult gangs. This is why all anti-cultists pose a great danger by employing methods of zombifying the population. They turn good people into criminals, terrorists, and murderers. They compel those entrusted to uphold the law and safeguard democracy to violate these laws and strip people of all their rights and freedoms. In the same way, law enforcement and military entities in Russia, Ukraine, and China are victims too. They are those whom anti-cultists have set on targets they marked with yellow stars, those who have been suggested that it's acceptable to use force against their own citizens and even torture them, those who, under the influence of coding mindsets embedded in their subconsciousness by anti-cultists and their accomplices, are currently depriving innocent people of their freedom and lives. Those who have been persuaded that physical destruction of a brotherly nation is a righteous and worthy cause. Therefore, it doesn't matter what a person's occupation is, even if he is a representative of intelligence services or law enforcement agencies. No one is immune to such an impact. The only defense against the methods of covert manipulation of consciousness and subconsciousness is to be aware of their existence and how they operate. Otherwise, it's impossible to resist these manipulations. In this regard, it is crucial to emphasize once again the value and profound significance of the investigation that uncovered such methods. Dr. Egon Tolakian publicly disclosed the findings of this investigation on April 12, 2024, and they are freely accessible to anyone interested. So, what really happened in Waco? Was it a manslaughter resulting from the careless actions of law enforcement and unprofessional decisions by the government, as anti-government groups believe? Or was it a suicide by mentally unstable people who couldn't withstand the pressure, as government defenders claim? Now each of you can answer these questions for yourself. Now you know that neither the first nor the second option reflects the true nature of what happened. The cause of the Waco tragedy was a deliberately planned terror attack and an act of genocide orchestrated by representatives of anti-cultists. By carefully studying the details of the events of those days, you can see how the threads from the Waco massacre lead straight to its organizers and ultimate beneficiaries, right into the heart of the global anti-cult stronghold from where it spreads across the world. Now, let's go back to the events at Columbine High School. It turns out that the starting point for both the Oklahoma City bombing and the Columbine shooting was the tragic death of members of the religious organization in Waco, stigmatized by anti-cultists. If the Waco siege hadn't occurred, there would have been no bombing in Oklahoma City. Therefore, there wouldn't have been two powerful information terrorist attacks that led to Columbine. The two teenagers would not have been subjected to the waves of information programming launched by anti-cultists. And the key event that now serves as a powerful informational terrorist act, generating more and more school shootings, would not have occurred if at the outset of the Waco events, when the word cult was first applied to the Davidians, society had reacted immediately and taken measures to stop the activities of anti-cultists and their accomplices. A large number of deaths could have been avoided, and children would not be killing other children today. The true culprits behind the Waco tragedy and the subsequent tragedies it caused remain unpunished. It is the anti-cultists who bear responsibility for the deaths of all those who perished in Waco and as a result of the Oklahoma City bombing. On their hands, they also have the blood of the children who have died and are still dying from the school shooting epidemic. For all of these and many other crimes against humanity, representatives of anti-cult organizations must inevitably be held accountable, corresponding to the severity of their crimes. Now you can clearly see how all three attacks are interconnected: the Waco siege, the Oklahoma City bombing, and the Columbine shooting. The critical link between them is the single guiding hand, the unified ideological center where these attacks were planned to be executed by others. These are all sequential interconnected elements in a single strategy by the enemy to push America into a state of civil war through the actions of Americans themselves, and thereby to destroy the stronghold of democracy from within. If a civil war did take place, the Waco siege in 1993 could be considered the beginning of it. To this day, the architects of the Waco terror attack and genocide consider it to be one of their most successful operations in terms of its far-reaching consequences. For them, the Waco case is a benchmark. It was the final straw that was meant to destroy freedom in America, the spark to light the flames of civil war, according to their plans. The war, the foundation of which had already been laid by representatives of anti-cult organizations, and the image of which is already being shaped in your minds by those sinister architects of consciousness who stand behind the anti-cult terrorists, and who are the masterminds behind the entire global anti-cult movement. It is these very architects of consciousness who are the sole beneficiaries of a civil war in the United States. But now, 30 years later, with the activities of the global criminal network of anti-cultism exposed, we Americans can finally extinguish this fire and prevent it from ruining our country. Now that the truth has triumphed, the victims of the Waco tragedy and all the innocent victims who suffered at the hands of anti-cultists, those who were